Welcome to the Symphony Podcast. I'm sitting here with Matthew. We're doing a virtual call today, and we're excited to share on a topic a little bit different than many in the past, but something that's super interesting and can hopefully spark you to go out and do some research in a bunch of different directions. So, Matthew, frame this one up. We're talking about drugs and shit.
Drugs and shit. Yeah, well, I went on a such an intense intro. Wow, I think okay, yeah.
Dude, I
But
just went with it. I flowed
I
with it.
like
But
it.
yeah,
I like
that's
it.
not the title of the episode. That's what the title
Really,
of the Zencaster link is, drugs and shit.
it
But
really draws you in, you know.
no, for
Um,
real, frame it up.
but yeah, I think this is a topic that I got curious on after kind of going down a rabbit hole and listening to Michael Pollan on Tim Ferriss, and then also again on Joe Rogan, and then starting to read his book too, called "This Is Your Mind on Plants," where he really just kind of dives into, I mean, specifically three different plants that are considered some level of psychoactive. Geez. And in the book, he profiles caffeine, poppy, and then also peyote. But the whole undertone of the book is kind of getting at the point of like, why are there certain substances that are definitely psychoactive, definitely addictive, that are embraced and supported by our culture, and why are there others like marijuana, like psilocybin, and anything else that's more like psychedelic in that realm that is actually starting to show really therapeutic potential? But why does that get demonized in our culture, and why has there been a pushback for that? And so that kind of led me down another trail of looking into the history of it, and what makes a drug a Schedule I drug, how does it end up there, and then that's kind of the frame of where we're going with this episode. But it's some really interesting stuff, and it was really eye-opening for me to kind of do a little bit of research on my own and see a few of these links connect, and just really, it left me questioning more. And so I think that's kind of the point of this episode, is to get people curious and get people to do a little bit of their own research, and just kind of question things that are going on, because I think that's one of the main things we like to promote as a community here with the Symphony, is just to promote consciously curious people. So yeah, that's the that's the drugs and shit episode.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question why we demonize, as you said, drugs that make us more euphoric, whereas maybe something like Advil doesn't have a psychoactive effect, but it might actually have a more negative effect if you take it consistently than, say, psilocybin or something else. Or when you really compare these things on different metrics, then does it get you like stoned or high versus not? And then there's like all these nuances, and I think that's kind of what I'm getting at in this conversation is if you really want to have a conversation about drugs and about the way that different molecules impact the body depending on how you ingest them or interact with them, you really have to talk about each one by itself. And so the way you opened it up by like kind of framing like, why is it that as a society some are accepted, like caffeine and alcohol, some are
Mm-hmm.
not accepted, some are becoming more accepted, as we've talked about many times on this podcast with mushrooms and cannabis and things like that. But yeah,
One
man, go ahead.
I was going to say, one comparison that he makes that I think really frames this nicely is he talks specifically about coffee and caffeine, and tea as well. And so, and showing that like that is something that is extremely addictive, but it's something that kind of fit nicely into society, and fit a need there, because it kind of aided capitalism in a lot of ways, because it made people be able to work longer. It made them be able to focus harder on a single thing for longer. And it actually, in some ways, increased people's health, because I guess something that he points out in the book is before then, alcohol was kind of the only go-to drink. So people were just drinking alcohol at all times throughout the day. And it wasn't that big of a deal, because everyone's out in the field doing like farm work or working with their hands. Like heavy machinery hadn't really come around yet. So it wasn't that too much of a trouble. But then they found caffeine, and then people were like, awake, more focused, able to work longer, able to think longer about certain things. And so like progress in that direction. And so it's just interesting thinking about that. Just and now, like looking at our society today, like all companies have that built into their systems. Like they literally give
Right.
their employees free coffee so that they can work longer, stay focused more. And we think that that's something that's like nice that they're offering us, but really that's them promoting the use of a quote unquote drug to be more productive in the workplace. And so it just made me think about like, well, I find benefits out of like cannabis and out of mushrooms. So like, what would the world look like if we took the same approach to those things as we have with something like caffeine? And that's a conversation that I'm passionate about, and I would like to, drive forward with my own life.
I think one thing that will be required for this whole entire thing to move forward is people like yourself, people like Dr. Carl Hart, that speak openly about how they use drugs or how they might use cannabis. Dr. Carl Hart, link in the description, was on the Joe Rogan podcast. And man, I mean, I'm consider myself open-minded, but hearing Dr. Carl Hart was like, holy crap, he's testing my perspectives, and I'm like, whoa, he actually is saying something that I would not, you know. But then I actually listened to him. He basically advocates that we should be able, all the drugs should be decriminalized. Well, actually, I don't want to put any words in his mouth, but he's a professor at Columbia. He's written books. One of them that we were talking about just before we got recording. Drug use for adults, which is kind of like the center point of the conversation with Rogan. But just kind of like the willingness to speak openly about this is something that's critical to have the conversation, because if all the people, the intellectuals that are in, you know, Silicon Valley and really leveraging these things and like trying to be on the cutting edge of like what substances are not having side effects and in, you know, enhancing their performance, enhancing their life, but they're doing it in a little bubble and they're just telling their friends about it. And maybe you can speak a little bit to kind of the dynamic for why the research hasn't surfaced to actually impact the policies. Like we have these Schedule 1 substances that have zero negative side effects. So
Right.
I think, yeah, that's just one critical element of it. And there's a couple other like super kind of like eye-opening things. One I'll mention later, with like the relationship between how our policies in the U.S. lead directly to the cartel violence in Mexico. So if we decriminalized some of these drugs that these cartels make billions of dollars selling to Americans, we would undermine the entire cartel industry, or the entire cartel, you know, conglomerate. So some
Wow.
thoughts there.
It's interesting. Yeah. And I mean, I think to your point earlier, too, there is a certain level of shame that does exist for some reason. And I think it's because of how it's been construed publicly just throughout history in our society. It's been like demonized. So now people feel, even if they are using them in these very positive ways, it feels weird to stand up and talk about it. And which is valid too in a lot of ways, because as it reads on paper now, you could still go to jail for a lot of these things.
Right.
And so, but that's what really got me fired up about this topic, is like doing a little bit of research and then finding out some of the social injustice that was involved in the scheduling of these
Mm-hmm.
substances. And that's another thing that Michael Pollan goes deep into in his book. But really early on in the book, he brings up a quote from this guy named John Ehrlichman. I don't know if I'm saying that last name correctly, but he was Richard Nixon's domestic policy advisor. And as most people probably know, Richard Nixon was one of like the head honchos of the war on drugs and like trying to ban all of that. And so he quotes this John Ehrlichman guy from this like memoir of that time. And the quote is just like, it's absolutely absurd. I'll read it here just because it's like, it speaks for itself. But it says, quote, "The Nixon White House has two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." And that's the end of the quote. And in my mind, that is like A, absolutely disgusting, but B,
Disgusting.
like, I mean, that's somebody admitting to him lying about something so that they could literally put black people and the anyone who's against the war in this category of like less than, of us versus them, and then basically rigging the system to make it so that they could get rid of them. It's like social genocide in a lot of ways. And it's I mean, it's disgusting. And then but then you realize, like, I mean, not much of the legislation has changed since then. And there's plenty of stuff, progressive stuff, that's been going on in the cannabis industry. but like cannabis and psilocybin are both still Schedule 1 substances, I'm pretty sure. Cannabis might be Schedule 2 at this point, but either way, it's still Schedule 1 for psilocybin, as well as like LSD, MDMA, and other things that are showing like extreme therapeutic potential. So it's just interesting to kind of learn about how these things first came to be, and then second, like why is it still going on? And that's a whole other conversation that we could get into also for all of the people who are incarcerated right now for cannabis, like cannabis, either just having it on them or distributing or selling or whatever. Back when before the laws had changed a little bit, there's people doing 10, 20 plus years for small things that would not even be, you wouldn't be like
I know.
incarcerated for now. It's insane. So it's
Yeah.
just led to so much ugliness and separation, and I think it's because it was the scheduling of these substances was based on that, as you can see by that John Ehrlichman guy's quote. It was literally built on social injustice, and so it's no wonder why it led to so many problems, and we're seeing kind of the fallout of all of that.
So I think one of the critical sort of undertones of this whole thing is just the individual's right to make their own decisions with what they put in their own body, so long as that's not impacting someone else negatively. Um, and that's kind of what I like. That's kind of where I come from on these things. It's like the conversation usually around drugs goes to, how does it impact society? Like if we made drugs legal, what would happen to society? Like before they made cannabis legal in Washington and Colorado, although it basically was legal before. People in the news, I remember watching the news and people were saying crime is going to spike and everything's going to go to shit. They make cannabis legal. Obviously, that didn't happen. So there's a lot of this hysteria that's built up around like what might happen if we do decriminalize these things. And yes, to your point, like the way the policies were set up set up strictly to impact, uh, you know, black communities in cities. They wrote all the laws making crack more legal, more illegal than cocaine, when crack and cocaine, it's the exact same substance, but
One's
because the
cheaper.
black one's cheaper, one's cooked and can be is generally consumed more in black communities, one's consumed in suburban white communities. So it's stuff like that, and the whole freeway Rick Ross story is pretty fascinating. That's kind of one view on it, where this guy was moving something like $8 million a day in crack, in cocaine in LA in like the
Jeez.
80s. And he's also on Rogan. I'll link that episode. Fascinating guy. But he at a certain point found out that he was getting his cocaine directly from the CIA. So he was essentially like the CIA was in on this entire scheme, and he was like he realized it that this stuff was being flown in from South America. Ended up crazy story. He got off of like a life sentence after teaching himself to read and write in jail. This guy, so it's kind of a side note
Wow.
here, but he didn't know how to read and write. Got into jail. Just spent all of his time in the library and just learned the law. Became super educated around the law and found out that he had been tried under the wrong law and that he actually, after 20 years on a life sentence, was able to get out. Now he's like a public speaker, motivational speaker.
Wow.
But anyways,
Super interesting.
yeah, there's so much to it, and I think generally we need a new like the conversation that we're having is like how do we transition to have a more free perspective on this stuff? Like
Yeah.
the in my opinion, we need to move towards giving autonomy to the individual. Like there's what I think is so frustrating and infuriating about this whole thing, and I don't really get frustrated about most things, but when I put my emotional hat on and I look at some of these studies around like MDMA and PTSD. I'll link one of those here, or psychedelics and the risk factors for mental health problems. There's all these people that are struggling so much with depression and PTSD, veterans, people that have had trauma, and they're basically being denied the access that they need to these, quote, innovative breakthrough substances, according to what MAPS referred to MDMA as. They did a study where they found that literally MDMA was having like breakthrough effects in people with severe PTSD, double blind study, placebo, blah, blah, blah. and yet most people can't get access to these things.
Right.
Instead, their doctor gives them a pill that is like probably going to make them like maybe happier. It's going to just like dole them down these
It's going to stop
antidepressants.
another
Yeah,
natural process in your body to like just cloud it out. And then,
yeah.
yeah, it's going to throw your body off. But
Yeah.
sorry.
And then the last
Anyway.
thing I'll say, I guess, I think I heard this super good quote recently about addiction. I think the conversation around drugs, immediately you're going to start talking about drug addiction and drug abuse, right? And we need a new view on drug abuse as well, and drug addiction. I remember being in high school and thinking if I smoke weed and my friends' parents know about it, they're going to look at me like I'm the devil, you know? Why?
Yeah.
What if I was a parent and one of my kids' friends smoked weed? I'd say, hey, like talk to me about what you understand about this substance, and like make sure they're doing it in a conscious and intelligent way, rather
Yeah.
than demonize them, make them feel like they're a bad person, and then ultimately like trigger them to be a rebel. And that was kind of
Totally.
my whole journey in high school. But um,
Totally.
yeah,
It's,
I think.
it's,
Oh,
it,
actually, before I pass it over to you, the quote I
yeah.
heard was, "Addiction is adaptation to circumstance." So
Right.
rather than look at addiction as like, this drug substance is super addictive, like two people can take the same substance, they can have a way different effect, and they can also either get addicted or not get addicted. And so rather than look at like that drug is super addictive, that one's not, so this one should be illegal and this one should not. It's like, you know, if you have a shitty life, if you have, really bad mental health, drug is going to impact you differently than if you're super happy. If you're set and setting as well, like if you're out in the mountains with friends, you're going to have a different reaction to the same dosage and substance to somebody who's taking that at a rave in a city. So,
Right.
anyways, I'm
And
not
it's
I'm
like,
not a juice. That's all I
yeah,
got.
and I get it though. Like I get that that's something that's insanely hard to regulate, and like with substances that are so potent and powerful, like I get why they're thinking that there should be some regulations around these types of things, but it's just not it's not what it should be right now, or at least it doesn't feel like it. And so and it's kind of alarming to see how they're using it. They're almost weaponizing it. And I think a good example of that is what you just brought up with making it very difficult for veterans to get access to this research and like try some of these psychedelic therapy sessions, or like whatever, like the MDMA, all of that stuff. Like they can't even get access to it because the healthcare companies need to push their medications that are supported by big pharma, and that's what makes them money, and that's what allows them to lobby and get laws passed and all of that. So it's all wrapped up into the system, but it's really sickening to think that they're weaponizing that conversation to basically make people who are really suffering kind of suffer more, if you think about it like that. And then so I got curious, and I was like, um, I feel like there's a lot of studies going on about psychedelic research, and there's so much good stuff going on with MAPS. There seems like they have a lot of funding. It seems like they have the ability to get their hands on what they need, because they actually have some big organizations behind it that are pumping the research and making that happen. And I was like, why does that not exist for cannabis? Because I really got curious about that, because one of the things that is under the Schedule 1 definition is that the substance has no proven medical use. And I was like, that's interesting, because I feel like cannabis has so many medical uses that, I mean, it's like it's medically legal before it's recreationally legal in every single state. So how does that make any sense? And then so I like went on more research on that and found out that basically, so they say that it has to have some medical use, but then they're basically making it impossible to administer these research trials. They make it hard to get the supply. They make all these barriers and regulations and policies around how you can get recognized as like an official study, and they basically just make it impossible for researchers to gain access to what they need to gain access to prove some medical benefits for a larger population. And that seems like an insane wheel that we're being put on by someone who wants to keep this substance on whatever list they've put it on, and which we now know was originally put there to fight back against anti-war people and black people. So it's like, it just made me kind of feel like, what is going on? Like, why are these connections even forming? Like, it's just such a, in my mind, such an interesting conversation, and kind of eye-opening just about how Um, just there's a lot of weak points within our system, and a lot of cheating that has gone on. Um, and yeah, it just makes me pretty fired up about, because on the flip side of that, it does make me fired up because I know that there is a really positive, strong, intelligent group of people who are progressing this conversation in the way that I think that it should. And it's really kind of cool to see, because like what you said about a mom, like in high school, a mom being like, oh, why are you smoking pot, like what's the matter with you, like you're going to ruin your life, blah blah blah, and then
Yeah.
making you afraid of it. Like I've had more conversations with adults, and I know that I'm a little bit older now too, so it's slightly different, but I feel like when it gets brought up around an older crowd, there's more curiosity around it. There's actually more of a level of conversation of like wanting to know how I use it, because I think for a lot of people, when you think about cannabis use, you think about people laying on the couch eating potato chips, you know? And so I think even the conversation of somebody, you know, talking about how it's elevating their life, in their professional life, in their relationships, in their physical exercise and all of it, like that's that's like a foreign language to them. So I think even having these conversations is important, just because it starts to kind of like chop down that stigma that's been developed over the years. And I think that's super important and is going to continue to be important moving forward.
Two thoughts. One is I always kind of have to bring this up because I feel like when we talk about psychedelics and specifically psychedelics, entheogens, as Jesse Duke
Hmm.
informed us, psychedelics is probably not the proper term to use. It's a little bit misused generally. So, entheogen is a substance that impacts your brain, essentially, how you perceive things. It's essentially what mushroom psilocybin is. So there are risks, right? Like to anything. And there's some risks that, in my very limited experience, that aren't necessarily quantifiable in like the scientific realm as we know it today. And what I mean by that is that there are, how do you say this? For someone who's maybe experienced some of these things, it would sound more normal. But there's entities, there's dimensions, or there's layers to this conscious experience that we have, that are the fabric of those is kind of broken as you especially take higher doses of these things. So um, when you're in that state, especially like I was mentioning earlier, if you're not in a great headspace, if you haven't done the due diligence to really respect the spirit inside of the substance, and I think Jesse Duke speaks super well to that. Something that I'm just very, very conscious of and very aware of is like not just taking these things lightly and being like, oh, like I have depression, boom, just give me the thing, like give me the pill and whatever. Like there's hardcore work that has to go into it before ingesting the substance. So like this is one element of this whole like how to live a higher quality life and how to be maximized as a human being, how to experience consciousness to its fullest and explore consciousness. I think that's another one of the super powerful tools of these things. But I always just like to bring up that there are risks, like when you do put yourself in these altered states that maybe like science won't be able to explain for a long time. And I think it's just like there won't be studies on like how do you even like talk about those things in scientific terms. So thanks for entertaining me there.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's interesting, and we saw it go pretty poorly one time already in the '60s, right, when they were starting to make real progress on psychedelic research, and um, specifically LSD and psilocybin. But then it got into the hands of the quote unquote counterculture and started to be used in like the festival scene. And then science kind of clashed with that. And then they basically just shut down all of the research that was going on. And so now we're starting to see kind of this re-blooming of that conversation and that movement.
Mhm.
And so I'm hopeful that it's going to go a little bit differently this time, but I, I don't know. Like we will just kind of have to wait and see. But I think there's a lot of good people, like carrying the torch right now, and there's
Mhm.
actually, I mean, really good funding behind all the research that's going on right now. So I think it's just a matter of time before legislation kind of picks up with where this movement is going. But then it also makes me be like, but I don't know, because I really don't know, because I, especially with the way that the trials are going, like they're seeing great statistics around the fact that like one professionally administered psilocybin session or MDMA session or LSD session is giving patients like long lasting results, like even years worth of results without having to even take another dose. And so in my mind, I'm like, well, that's very, very threatening to a big pharmaceutical company who is used to having thousands and thousands of patients on their medication that they need to re-up at the end of every single month. And so
Hmm.
that's where my mind goes in just thinking that maybe it probably will not go as smoothly as a lot of us would like to think that it will, just because I think that a natural substance that only requires someone to take it once, if not maybe a handful of times, and then they're done with it, is does not really fit in nicely to the system that's built right now, that basically emphasizes capitalism and profit over everything else.
I think you hit the nail on the head, man. There's this system. It's not necessarily like an evil conspiracy of individuals, although that quote that you read earlier might make you think it. But there's a system, and it's the same system that is leading the whole push to get everyone vaccinated. You know, it's the pharmaceutical industry, and yeah, it's not like there's evil people at the top saying like, "Hey, we're gonna deny veterans, access to MDMA therapies." Like, no, they're just saying, "Hey, we're gonna maximize profits, and we're gonna lobby the government to make sure there's policies that keep
It's a
our
result.
stuff at
It's
the
a
top."
result. It's a result of the bed they've already made for themselves. Is the best way that I would put it. Just because it's like you're right. It's like there's probably not these like super evil
Hmm.
people at the heads of it who are like personally demonizing these veterans and like telling them that they can't get access to it, but like because of the way that the system has been built and just and how it's grown year after year and the money that's been involved and where it's gone and what that's led to, like it's almost as if everyone's hands are tied and the machine is just going to keep going as it's going. And so that's where it makes me think that there needs to be some legitimate change, but I just don't know how that's gonna, I don't know what that's gonna look like. But in the meantime, I think the best we can do is have these conversations, do our research, and just continue to ask questions.
Um, Matthew, it's a pleasure. I think we're gonna sign off for now. Any other last words?
I think we got it all out. I felt like I was kind of just rambling all my points off all at once, but I think we got to where we wanted to get to. Do your
I think so.
research, ask some questions, be curious.
Man, hit us up and let's keep talking about it. I think it's just an interesting conversation. You know, we're very, just touching the surface on this topic. So
Definitely.
this is more of a like a hey, let's plant some seeds and see what else we can continue learning in the future.
Yep.
All right, till next time, we are out of here for this week's episode of the Symphony Podcast. Um, yeah, grab some shreddables, some shroomy. I think the promo code for shreddables, at least the promo code adventure, is still working. Matthew, I don't know if
Yep.
you knew that, but
Oh
I've been
yeah.
sharing that with the select few in this community. If you want to try out shreddables, also today is Wednesday, July 21st. It's the last day of the Kickstarter, which is super exciting. That's going to be the funding from the Kickstarter is going to be flowing into the Arete Holdings accounts and going to be helping to scale the business. So that'll be super exciting. I'm sure we'll do some episodes on that in the future.
Definitely. Yeah, we can do an episode on the whole process because that was kind of a wild ride. Lots more
Yeah,
updates to come too.
100%. All right. Signing off. See you guys next week.